Okay, welcome everyone. Can you hear me okay? We want to be able to acknowledge who's in the room. By a show of hands, let's see West Africans, East Africans, Central Africans, Southern Africans, North Africans, people who just like Africa and want to come support us. Wonderful, wonderful. Welcome to the 2019 Africa Development Conference panel, The Prosperity Paradox, Policy, Entrepreneurship, and Development in Africa. It was the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who once observed that African poverty is a scar on the conscience of the world. In the land of plenty, it is mind-boggling that we haven't been fully able to utilize our resources for development on the African continent. Today, these panelists will help us understand policy and how its implications for entrepreneurship affects development on the African continent. My name is Mark Sarbah, and I'm a graduate student here at Harvard. I'm very excited about moderating this panel so that all of us can, one way or the other, involve in a dialogue that will help us uncover the potential of our continent. So, welcome once again. Now, we've assembled a very knowledgeable panel to be able to help us understand how the issues are on the African continent. Our first panelist is a professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's also a professor of law at the University of Ghana. He was formerly executive secretary to the president of Ghana. He's consulted for a number of international organizations, including the United Nations, the European Commission, to mention but a few. He received his BA and LLB in law from the University of Ghana Law School, a Master of Laws from Harvard University, and an SJD, which is a Doctor of Law from the Harvard Law School. Please give a round of applause for Professor Raymond Atuba. Our second panelist is the founder of Jamie Life. Previously, she was the general manager as well as CEO of GE Technology South Africa, and was very instrumental in a number of infrastructural projects within transportation. More recently, she is a Mason Fellow here at the Harvard Kennedy School, pursuing a Master of Public Administration. Prior to that, she was at the Said Business School at Oxford University, where she received an MBA. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Zenith Brahim. Our third panelist is the Chief Innovation Officer for Duracell Company. Prior to that, he had been involved in growing Procter & Gamble for over 25 years on the African continent. He's very passionate about advising young people and also businesses in regards to how to more effectively charter their trajectories. He received a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Cambridge in England, as well as a bachelor's in chemical engineering from the University of Surrey, also in England. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Dr. Liebman. The last but not the least is our fourth panelist, who worked with the IFC and was mostly based in Nairobi, Kenya. Was very instrumental in a number of financial deals while he was with them. He's also worked in investment banking with first with Barclays Bank and also Merrill Lynch. And right now he's a dual MBA and MPP degree candidate here at the Kennedy School as well as the Business School. Please give it up for Mark Anani. Wonderful. I thought since it's been a very, very long day with all of you moving back and forth, and also because of a bit of a drag in terms of the panel being delayed, we'll start with a story. So imagine that today is a Monday in most parts of Africa. It will be nighttime in most parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Imagine the story of a young boy by name Babatunde, who had spent the day earlier in school receiving instructions in makeshift classrooms under a tree. His mom, Watumalo, would be returning from a long day in a market over several kilometers away. while on her way home, the driver would overspeed, endangering the lives of the passengers. When they got to a checkpoint, the policeman by name Kone was negligent and was not even interested in the overspeeding. Instead, he was more interested in taking a bribe in the amount of $1. So he did that. 15 minutes later, when the bus left, traveling on rickety roads, on muddy and muddy roads, the bus was involved in an accident, and Babatunde's mother died. Earlier in the day, his uncle, Vuyo, had spent all his savings taking a taxi to go to the nearest hospital. When they got to the hospital, there were over 200 patients to one doctor. And for that matter, he was asked to wait till the next day to get attended to. By the time the next day came around, he passed away. Now, in the midst of the glitter and glamour of skyscrapers and development, as we like to celebrate, which is well worth it, is also this other side of the story, mostly in the rural areas, in the gutter, where the glitter doesn't show. These are the kinds of people that Howard Thurman would describe as people who have their backs against the wall. Now to my panelists, what does this story mean for you? And how does that fit into policy, entrepreneurship, and development in Africa? Dr. Tuguba.
Well, so interesting story. I think the first thing I would like to communicate is that we would achieve a lot in African development if we just started not with macroeconomic theories, but with stories like this. Now, one thing that stories do is to portray reality. But stories also have another value. If you're able to dissect a story and point out exactly the policy, legal, institutional, regulatory, economic analysis impetuses that lead to the strands of the story, you would be beginning an analysis that will lead you to the answers. In other words, every part of that story is generated by certain policy choices that were made by somebody or some people. And the way in which you can start addressing those elevating issues that he narrated in the story is to trace the incidents in the story back to the policy choices that implicated them. That's what I'll say for now.
Thank you. So that story, I think, draws on three key themes I'm sort of interested in for prosperity and development. The first relates to the youth challenge. Babatunde goes to school, but we don't know if he's going to be able to get a job afterwards. And so it's really about harnessing the youth so that it becomes a big opportunity as opposed to a ticking time bomb. The second relates to the challenge of bridging the formal and informal sectors. So taxi drivers, going to hospital, not having insurance, not having access to financial services. And then the final one relates to urbanization in cities in Africa, which creates a big housing challenge. So those are sort of three themes that I pulled from that story, three themes I'm interested in personally, and that I think are key drivers for future prosperity on the African continent.
Thank you. Dr. Liebman.
I think the first thing I would say is, the story just made me feel sad in a way. But also it's actually a story that probably happened in many African countries, not just only one, and maybe beyond the Babatunde family, could be many families. But it highlights two things in my view. One is the importance of focusing on the big sectors that will impact the life of people, such as health, education, which is really reflected in the stories. And then the second thing is, beyond development, economic development, it's also important to really educate people about accountability, responsibility, which in this story, what the policeman should have done in a situation like that. So those would be my takeaways from the story.
hope that this isn't a dangerous question. But I wanted to just ask, how many of you feel like you struggle through your education, your primary education? Maybe just by your hands. Okay, so what resonated in what I told Mac when he asked me what I did about the story is that there were so many parts of it that I could associate with in my own life. So my mother teaches at a very poor school where I went to school. And this idea of a taxi taking kids to school and the driver not being certified and the driver not showing up to pick up the kids, or someone's mother. I grew up on the Cape Flats in Cape Town in South Africa. If any of you are familiar with South Africa, you'll kind of resonate with the level of violence. So one day you'll hear a story about a child whose mother's been shot by their father. That wasn't reflected in the story, but that's what I heard. And then I look across the room and there's so many young people in the room, and I think when I think about the question of what this means for policy, entrepreneurship, and development, is it reinforces to me that we have an obligation to create the life we want by reflecting on how we got out. And I often think about that because I'm one of so few people from my community that got out. And then I kind of think back to what were the enabling factors, and it was my teachers who went to competitions with me that meant that I got scholarships, etc. So it was very personal, and I think it mostly reinforced that, whether it be in policy or as an entrepreneur, which I'm now being, or in development, that each of us have a role to play, and that's stronger needed than I think ever before.
Thank you very much. Those are all very interesting responses. My next question is to Dr. Ramana Taruba. The 2018 World Bank Doing Business Report showed sort of the widest range of performance within Sub-Saharan Africa. With the rankings, you have Mauritius at 25, South Africa at 82, Ghana at 120, and Somalia 190. This is out of 190 countries. Now, when you think about that, that certainly has implications for entrepreneurship on the African continent, because if it's so difficult to do business on the continent, then it hampers the growth of SMEs and entrepreneurship on the African continent. Can you walk us through some of the regulatory and bureaucratic obstacles you think have contributed to this, and what's the role of policy in addressing them?
Sure. So I want to address this question by talking about three scenarios. And if you don't remember anything else I say today, try to remember these three scenarios. They are real stories, they actually happened, and they are happening, and I've been involved in them. The first is about the young guy who imports and distributes rare medicinal tea from China, and he distributes it in Ghana. It's called Fata. And he was able to start this business with $1,000. He makes enough profit to sustain his family and has started expanding. How did he do this? He does not register his business annually as required by law and saves money and time resources thereby. He also eliminates his exposure to murderous taxes and fees from the state. He does not pay central government taxes. Because he operates from home, he does not pay local government taxes at the local market. He must have paid his way at the port of entry to avoid horrendous import duties, or ship the goods to a free port in another West African country, and then brought them into Ghana through unapproved routes, or routes, as you say here, that have no customs and excise men and women. He did not certify his goods with the Ghana Standards Board at a huge fee and also a long wait period. Neither did he do same at the Food and Drugs Authority, and there are many, many other authorities he should have gone to if he was doing things right. He did not obtain a health certificate at the local authority, which you require when you're selling food products. could mention 25 more policies, laws, regulations that FATA positively disobeyed in order to build a thriving business. The first lesson I want to convey with this story is this. To be a successful entrepreneur in Africa, one safe way in the face of a regulatory environment that is anti-entrepreneurial is to stay safely illegal and thrive. Second story. Due to time constraints, I would have bridged the second story. Hassan, another of my friends, he's always been a good guy. Everybody knows Hassan to be the guy who's good. Almost a saint, he always does things right. Unlike Fata, he did things according to the book when he started his business. Right down to obeying the laws on upfront tax stickers, where you pay tax before you actually earn money, and the social security payments for his workers. He made no profits in 2 years and only survived on his second job. And he showed me the figures. I saw the figures on the business. It was impossible to stay legal and make profits. Late last year, I encouraged him to talk to others in the industry, get into their confidence, so they teach him the tricks of the trade. He did. All the others were operating like Fata, but in a more open and different way. They were understating sales by up to 99% to the tax people, and engaging in other sophisticated deals to make more profits. The second lesson is clear. If you're a goody-goody two-shoes entrepreneur in Africa, you will definitely fail. The third and last story. I used a video of a Kenyan entrepreneur to teach one of my classes on law and development at the law school in the fall. You can see some of my students here, so they'll remember. Now, this Kenyan entrepreneur is supposed to have started a business with $48, and is making huge returns, and is expanding tremendously. Looks like a miracle. So it looks like she did not do what Fata did, right? But believe me, she broke many laws. The only difference between she and Fata is that she was anointed by donors and NGOs and traditional and new media, and made into an iconic entrepreneur. And thus became untouchable by the authorities. Indeed, she even won a huge money prize from somewhere here in the US. This story provides the third lesson and explains the other category of many entrepreneurs who are not underground and appear open and legal and doing well. They are not legal. They are as illegal as Fata's business, but are given a protective coat of legitimacy by donors, diplomats, NGOs, the media, and so on. To conclude, 3 lessons from this, and I promise I won't talk so much for the other questions. Lesson 1, policies and laws in Africa on literally anything, including those that border on entrepreneurship, and accepting those that are related to foreign investment, take their ethos from a tradition of lawmaking that focuses on what should be constrained by hegemony, rather than what should be facilitated or promoted. Yet sadly, entrepreneurship is about what needs to be facilitated and promoted, and would thereby always be given a rough and raw deal. Second lesson, to make it as an entrepreneur in Africa, you have to be adept at using sophisticated counter-hegemonic moves to beat the system and the hegemon. Final lesson, there are at least 3 counter-hegemonic moves and practices that subalterns or ordinary Africans use as they seek to beat the system, a system instituted and maintained by the hegemon. One, go underground and operate illegally, fata. Go above ground and pretend to operate legally, whilst using professionals, lobbyists, accountants, lawyers, PR consultants to engage in marginal legality or illegal conduct to survive. Hassan. 3, garner the anointing and covering of donors, diplomats, top government officials, NGOs, or the media to allow your enterprise to operate illegally without challenge or consequences, or to be subsidized when you get losses by a grant or award from some US NGO. Thank you.
That's an interesting response. And to piggyback on that, you use sophisticated hegemonic moves to beat the system. Now, I'd like to tie that into a question for you, Mark. Now, given the absence of credit information available from registries and bureaus, what are some of the challenges that financial institutions face in their ability to determine which enterprise is eligible for funding? And given the fact that Professor Tuguba just spoke about the difficulties and the fact that people can fabricate all these documents and things of the sort to sort of subvert their eligibility, what would you say to that?
Sure. So I think the biggest challenge of lending in emerging markets in general, Africa in particular as well, is how do you lend to people that don't have formal credit history, both at the enterprise level and at the individual level. The challenges you're facing obviously are for a business, people not reporting their income properly. For individuals, it's the same kind of thing. There are credit bureaus in, say, Kenya, for example, and lots of other African countries, but they're just new, developing. American companies like TransUnion are coming over, but what that presupposes is that you're part of the formal system. I think one area that I think we're going to see happening going forward is telecoms companies becoming banks, right? Because if we take the example of Kenya with M-Pesa, Safaricom basically knows absolutely all your income, all your transactions, and using that sort of massive aggregate data can tell you things about your behavior. Those things can then be fed back into a loop to decide what type of credit you are. And given that everyone basically uses something like M-Pesa in a country like Kenya, that's sort of how you come around it. So it's, again, sort of bridging the informality that you mentioned, making it more formal, and then giving people opportunity by being able to lend to them, etc. Banks being able to take more risk.
Thanks for that response. That's great. Let's veer off a little bit more into kind of the infrastructural component of it. Dr. Haley, the World Bank reports that access to electricity is very important for the growth of enterprises. And according to the International Energy Agency in 2016, about 625 million Africans do not have access to electricity. What's the role of the private sector, including Duracell, in overcoming this challenge? And what kind of policy mechanism do you think would underpin this?
Yeah, so if you really look at electrification, there is a linear correlation between economic development and electrification. So unfortunately, in many African countries, when it comes to electricity and power, the countries are really, really by far behind. So there's a lot of improvement that needs to happen. In fact, there is a McKinsey report that you can refer to. If you look at Sub-Saharan Africa particularly, which has 13% of the world population, it has 48%, represents 48% of the population in the world that has no access to electricity. That's huge when you think about it. So forget even the remote parts of many parts of Africa, but even in the urban areas, power is not reliable, right? There's a lot of failure in the grid. So when you look at all these issues related to electricity, companies like Duracell or any other companies for that matter, they can play a big role in pretty much transforming the power industry. Governments also will have responsibilities, particularly in promoting large-scale power distributions, allowing private companies to come in, maybe outsource some of their power needs, and creating incentives and regulation that, in fact, allow companies to come in and serve that purpose. So one of the areas, for example, we need to think about as we think about powering Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa for that matter, is that how do you, in fact, bring technology? So companies could help bringing technology, funding, and so on and so forth. At the same time, governments could allow ease of doing business and allowing these companies to probably flourish in a way that creates incentive for them to have a return on their investment. So really there is one big area of infrastructure development to power Africa. We heard today from one of the ministers in Nigeria about the power challenge. I think a lot of countries have these issues, but I tell you, beyond the government support and beyond what large-scale power companies could do, the other big movement that's really coming up, and I do truly believe it will be an innovation that will transform this continent, is this idea of consumers taking, in their own hands, generating power and serving themselves. So basically, you may have seen in some of the developed markets where people could generate their own power using a solar panel with the battery. So if you look at the advancement of battery technologies, the advancement of photovoltaic solar panels, they are allowing actually people to generate their own power and eventually distribute and serve their own selves. So I do believe those kind of entrepreneurial way of looking at technology would transform the continent, because people are not going to wait until government starts spending or investing grid. The grid power will take 20 years to actually implement. And so this small micro level development in different communities would definitely serve the electrification issue in Africa, particularly the remote parts where consumers are off grid. They don't have to worry about the grid coming to them. So in the same way, cell phones have transformed a lot of the economic development in Africa, I do believe the combination of battery technologies with a solar panel or any natural source of energy will transform the power sector.
Thank you, that's a wonderful response. And still on infrastructure, Zenith, I'd like to get your thoughts. In the area of cross-border trade, high transportation costs pose a lot of barriers to trade. From your work with GE, what are some of the obstacles to effective infrastructure, particularly rail infrastructure, and also like high-speed trains as we see in China? And what are some of the implications for particularly the Africa continental free trade area in terms of like promoting effective trade within and amongst African countries?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that high speed is not commercially viable, and neither is passenger. So I'm going to talk about freight. And often politicians talk about what you see in the news, whether it be in Ethiopia or in Nigeria with their passenger line in Abuja, is about passenger, and it's political, but that doesn't pay, it doesn't drive economic growth, whether it be air or in rail. So I want to focus on the freight part. I'd love to get your views after.
Oh no, I was just saying that it's also very dangerous. It's not safe for passengers. That's the other thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I just on that point, I happened to be in Douala trying to get between Douala and Yaoundé when, I don't know if you guys remember or heard about the passenger train that derailed. And on the back of that, we then started discussing with the government to support them with their infrastructure, which we've been trying to do for several years before. But what was scary is we were debating whether we take the train or we drive. We ended up driving, and then a week later, the road split, which was just literally, it was meters, there was a big crack in the road. So yes, thank you. But I wanted to maybe, with regards to passenger, how many of you guys have been to the port in Lagos? Yeah? So if you just look out, you'll see a number of tankers usually transporting either oil, and if they're not transporting oil, they're transporting rice or fertilizer. And so without even going to interregional trade, just if you move fertilizer between north and south in Nigeria, you can fund the rehabilitation of that section of the rail line. So that was something that I really struggled with. So personally, outside of GE, wanted for a really long time to get to work with the government of Nigeria to implement on a project finance basis, just so that they can move fertilizer up and rice down, so that they would limit their imports of rice, because at the moment Nigeria imports a significant amount of their rice. So I wanted to start with that just as context, because now that I no longer work in rail, that vision still sticks with me. So I think there are three big challenges. One relates to capability, and I'll tell you guys a little bit what I mean. The other relates to interoperability, so the ability of rail lines to go across countries. And the third relates to finance. So with regards to capability, there are again two things that continue to haunt me. We did the first rail transaction in Mozambique, I want to say in 2012, that they had done in the 20 to 30 years preceding. And that was important for, I think, two reasons. One is that now Mozambique has the second largest rail fleet on the continent, which is really cool because they can export coal, which was their main source of income. And it also increased the capability across services. People are trained to do all kinds of artisanal things. But my point is that when we were negotiating that transaction, the counterparty, who's the Mozambican government, had not negotiated a transaction like that ever. Of the scale, and so sitting across as a private sector person, it really relied on us, and I was leading the negotiation, to make conscious effort to do the right thing at every step, because that contract could have been done so much in our favor as a result of a lack of capability on the government side to negotiate large infrastructure projects. And you see that across the board, whether it be in power or in rail or et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's a big issue. And I think as kind of young Africans, that's something that we need to think about in terms of how we can contribute. So that's one. The second thing is, just as I was transitioning out of the healthcare business in GE, we were moving our warehousing from Europe, and we wanted to move it to Africa. And we really tried to find a hub where we can consolidate all of our logistics, because we have stuff coming from China, from Finland, etc. We looked at Ethiopia, we looked at Kenya. South Africa doesn't work for geographical reasons, and probably wouldn't have worked for logistics as well in terms of the capability. We could not find a site in Africa that would allow us to consolidate and warehouse in Africa and fly, so the healthcare business fly, because it's high value items, we fly things. So both between the airline and the logistics system that would allow us, the GE at the time, to do that. So we ended up setting up the warehouse in Dubai with Emirates and a partner company there. And that was a real shame, because it now means that all of our contracts run through Dubai instead of through Ethiopia or Kenya, etc. So I think in terms of interoperability or trade, those two things, the capability on negotiating from a government for large infrastructure projects that will facilitate trade, and then secondly having the capability to do logistics, is a shame, and really talks to the human capital and capability development. The second thing on interoperability is, in all of the time that I've spent in rail, and it was close to 10 years, not one time were we able, or was the government of Zambia or Namibia or Angola talking to each other so that they could run locomotives across border. Now, there are two factors in rail that impact your ability to run across border. The one is the size of the gauge, so literally how wide the tracks are, and the second is the weight of a locomotive. So if it's too heavy, you end up getting the derailments that our colleague talked about here, and probably what happened in Cameroon. And then obviously if it's too wide, you can't adjust. So the trains that run in South Africa are too heavy to go into Mozambique. The trains that run in Zambia can't come, so same story, right? South Africa generally is a little bit heavier, a little bit more sophisticated rail system than anywhere else in Southern Africa, and so on. And then the other thing that happened related to that is, and this is a little bit controversial and not a GE view, it's mine, is that a lot of the infrastructure projects are obviously done by the Chinese. The Chinese have a very unique rail system. And what they do naturally is they build according to their rail system. And their rail system is interesting in the sense that it's wide and light. So usually what happens is, the wider you go, the more weight you can put on it. But they don't design like that. They design wide and light. So that was what they had planned to do in Angola. and to some extent is what happened in East Africa, who now are on standard gauge. So that means that those countries have a very unique system that doesn't talk to any other rail system on the continent. So we're in a place where in East Africa, so Kenya's gone with standard gauge, their rail system doesn't allow for any interoperability or any trade. So the only option is to go with road, which obviously has a number of other challenges. So I wanted to share a little bit, and I could probably talk about this for days, so I'm going to stop there. But it's a major challenge, and it's a shame because these are not projects that we can redo in our lifetime. Right? When Kenya happened, I was like, that's it for the next 100 years, because that's what rail is. We still have many colonialist rail systems that'll stay with us. I think maybe I will pause there and then we can talk about anything
Right,
else.
that's a very interesting insight. And to piggyback on that, on the sort of the infrastructural underpinning of China being in Africa, I'd like to go off of that and talk about what has become sort of a neo-colonialism. Dr. Atibuba, China has pledged about $60 billion to Africa. And just last year, by virtue of the Build Act, President Trump also pledged about $60 billion to developing countries. And many people think that this is what sort of offset China's dominance in developing countries. And coinciding with the visits of Theresa May and Angela Merkel, many have described this as a sort of neo-colonialism. And you know as well as I do that scholars such as Tambisa Moyo, William Easterly, have all sort of challenged the predominant aid approach to development on the African continent. Now, with this new dispensation, how do you think Africa can more effectively leverage these relationships for development, particularly within the context of the entrepreneurship?
Thank you. So it's clearly neo-imperialism. There's no doubt about that. But make no mistake about it, Africa needs that aid in the short term. If you take out that aid in the short term, the economies are going to slide back. Kids are going to get out of school. People are going to start dying in hospitals. So we need the aid, but in the short term. The mistake that African governments make is to allow aid in together with the conditionalities, and then allow those who give the aid to occupy the policy space. And when that happens, they cannot implement what they need to implement in the medium term in order to go beyond aid. That's the problem. And every African leader knows this. Our keynote speaker, my president, President Akufo-Addo, mentioned that yesterday. He said, I need to get my country beyond aid. But how do you do that when you need the aid in the short term to prevent people dying and prevent people getting out of school? So, in short, three things African countries need to do. One, take the aid. Take as much of it as you can. But in the short term only. In the short term only. Your aid framework, your aid programming must be in the short term. Second, implement the Africa Beyond Aid strategy in the medium term, not in the long term. You must have a medium-term strategy to get out of aid, and that's very possible. And then lastly, to prevent the occupation of your policy space, you have a big opportunity now to play China against the US and the UK. Negotiate strong and hard and protect the policy space so that you can, within that policy space, map out your medium-term agenda.
Thank you very much. Quite antithetical to that, Mark, I'd like to get your thoughts on, I think it's important to also kind of grow local access to funding. What are some of the cultural constraints that you think get in the way of African venture capital development of
Sure. So I think the first thing is in relation to the African story, particularly as told by Africans. I think so far we haven't necessarily done a good job at explaining both to international but also local investors that we're a continent full of investors, right? The overarching sort of Africa story is obviously one of poverty, disease, etc., etc. The second is there isn't enough necessarily education, necessarily in the business sector, in terms of sort of regulations at the policymakers level, really helping local investors, be they pension funds, be they foundations, etc., to understand the benefits, despite the risk of investing in the local sort of ecosystem. The third thing I would say is weak capital markets. In general, because corporate reporting isn't good enough, as you mentioned earlier, because there isn't a good understanding of that business sector, it makes it very hard, I think, to raise money, both for the entrepreneur, but also, let's imagine that you're a pension fund that does invest in a new startup. You know, there's no capital markets using an IPO, so you can't get that liquidity movement, you can't get out of your investments. Yeah, those I think are the main sort of areas that are stopping development of the local capitals.
That's a wonderful response. Dr. Liebman, we know for sure that energy will play a big role. In your opinion, what's the future of renewable energy in Africa?
Well, I think renewable energy in Africa, I think the future is bright, in my view. I think it can transform the continent because Africa has an abundant source of natural resources that are renewable. You know, most of the time the sun shines in most African countries, sadly. You know, when you look at wind, if you look at geothermal, all these renewable sources are really available in abundance. So the question is, you know, how do you harness this? And the technologies are available to harness those, but I think the key question is, you know, the affordability and the policies that the governments need to take, and how they allow entrepreneurs to come in and innovate. So, you know, my life is sort of revolves around innovation. That's what I've done for a lot of the consumer products and brands that I worked for many, many years. So I cannot help thinking about the way forward for economic development and really accelerating growth is to embrace innovation. And innovation is not simply technology, it's not simply product. It's also ideas, it could be business model, it's the way we think about how to solve problems. It's all about solving problems. So when you look at the challenges of Africa, most of them are common, really, really across many sub-Saharan Africa. So how do you really solve the problems? And it could be entrepreneurs in the local area, or it could be government sponsored, it could be NGOs, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, we gotta innovate and we need to embrace that concept. So, you know, coming back to your renewable energy, it's the same idea. I think because of the abundance of, you know, sources of natural sources of energy, one idea is there a way for democratizing power in Africa? The way you democratize power is, as I said earlier, trying to create this local macro level generation of energy through panels and other things that the technologies are harnessing. So I think that's, to me, the renewable way is a great path for Africa. I think the key question is, you know, how do you embrace the policies, at the same time, how do you really talk about it among the youth that matters in transforming the category through innovation?
Thank you very much. I think given the time constraint, we'll open it up to the audience and take 3 questions. Please be brief. Do not give a speech. Be brief. Let us get a question. And then also address it to which of the panelists you want to ask that question.
Thank you. Zenith and Dr. Hailu. So I'm a design thinker, and I'm an entrepreneur. I'm also Ugandan. And I really believe that what Dr. Hailu said has a lot of weight, and it's very important. The railroad structures by the Chinese, the thing that really I don't seem to understand, and as an entrepreneur, as an innovator or design thinker, is that nobody really thought about the soil African soil is so different from different countries. And so that's my question in regards to GE and these teams that were around that are looking at how the different rail systems were designed, or you were trying to help design.
So we'll take the questions first and then they'll just answer.
Hi, I'm Marlene Pachikinwe. I am majoring in accounting at American International College. And my question is to Zenith, that's obviously me. Why is it that Africa, like all the African countries don't have like a standard system for railroads for all the other African countries to facilitate transportation of natural resources around the continent?
And then let's take one from here.
So this whole policy thing, we seem to be thinking of as an either or, but the whole youth in all the continent and all the world is not thinking of it as either or. The youth are thinking about it as social entrepreneurs. And as social entrepreneurs, they don't think about it as non-profit and for-profit. They think about it as an integrated solution that puts them together. It would seem that your scenarios get changed if the government decides that any social business that positively impacts the country, they can be de-risked in groups.
Can you keep it brief, please?
That's the question. Why wouldn't the countries pool together the social entrepreneurs that are most scalable and de-risk them and legalize them in groups in one pass, so that you don't have those three scenarios for the people who have social impact? You have a, I can be a good person and solve the country's problems.
Thank you very much. Let's take a last one. One over here. You can just go ahead.
Okay, yes, my question is for Dr. Achu Kuba. Forgive me, Mike. Simple question. He talks about taking the money, right? Taking the money. You talked about taking the loans for investment. So historically, we know that.
Please don't go into a
Question is, very, very specific, and you and Mark can also respond to this as well. How do you, when there are no check and balances to ensure where the money goes, what are the steps do you think that can be put in place? Because obviously you have the know-how. We have people here who have the
Go ahead and
know-how.
ask the question. Let's end it there.
Right.
Fellas, can you respond to the questions? We're running a bit out of time. Sorry about that. Not a problem.
So I'll start, and I'll answer them both together. Sorry, and we can chat after. That would be great. So I don't like this answer because I hate thinking that there isn't something that we can do to change or create. Railways in Africa is a function of the colonialists. So if you think about the system in South Africa, it's the British system. The DRC, interestingly, has one of the most expansive rail systems, and if it works, they have the most cargo to move. So if someone were an entrepreneur that can solve that problem, that would be the most lucrative thing I can think of, but that's a side note. So South Africa is very integrated. If you think about the Portuguese, what they did in Angola and Mozambique is they created rail lines that go from mine to port.
Right.
And that's effectively extractive in its nature. So, and that's the most lucrative lines. So now you have a government that is cash strapped and should be investing in healthcare and education, thinking about priority number 10 is to make an effective rail system, which is very expensive. Do they build on what's existing or do they create new? What Angola, South Africa, Mozambique has done is they built on what's existing. What Kenya has done, and I think which is the way East Africa will go, is to create new. And you can't fault that because it's about creating a different life and there's so much pride and all of those things that go into that decision making. But as a result of that, it means that there isn't any interoperability. So I think it's very much not a function of today's leaders, but rather what has come from our history.
Thank you very much for that. Who's the next question for? Can you look ahead?
I'm not so sure what the specific question was for me, but
Who did you want Professor Tulu?
I'd take anybody's thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, you want to
Yes, so, excellent idea. The only reasonable thing to do is to de-risk these things. But surprisingly, and I'm talking about the context I'm most familiar with, there's now in Ghana's parliament a new companies bill. I don't know if it's passed. But there was a recommendation to lower the bar for some of these smaller companies. That proposal was positively rejected. And this is the reform of a 1963 law. So it's just about policy choices. Okay. Now, the most painful thing, and that comes to your question, the most painful thing is that it is not as if African countries do not have a history of de-risking certain types of investments. You know, almost every African country has foreign investment codes that provide huge de-risking. No import duties, 10 years tax holidays. And you sit and you wonder, you are doing this for foreign companies, and you can't do it for local struggling companies, innovative enterprises, right under your nose. It's amazing. I mean, negatively amazing.
So I think it was about tracking money and where it goes.
Well, yeah, I mean, how do you implement that? So you're getting the money to improve, please,
So I think the thing I'd start with is just aligning sort of recipient needs with, donor targets. So for example, if you decide you want to build a road, but the EU only have money for environmental protection, I mean, you're going to take that money and it's going to disappear, right? Like, you're going to do what you want. The second thing is really tracking impact. So the IFC has something called DOTS, which is Development Outcome Tracking System. And the idea is, if I lend, let's say $500 million to a bank for them to expand their housing portfolio, right? And then they just put that into retail senior unsecured lending, and we can easily track that and know that, look, the money's gone wrong somewhere along the way. I think going forward, and it's a bit buzzwordy, but I think open ledger technologies are going to help us be able to track as well, really, every cent from the point of disbursement going onward. So those are three potential solutions that would work. I'm sure there's dozens and dozens of others, but those are three I think I would focus on, and that makes sense and that are implementable in the short term.
Dr. Hill, I'd like to get your thoughts on kind of any of the questions.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just, I do agree. I think it's not just only government, it's not only just social entrepreneurs, it's a combination. So I think we need every force possible to lift this. I think the key question is you don't want to talk cross-purpose, and you want to make sure policies support the social entrepreneurs. At the same time, governments encourage not only just the local, but also the foreign investment. I think we need to address it from both ends. In fact, I have this lingering thought all the time whenever I think of sub-Saharan Africa. Can you really run African countries the way you run very successful corporate companies?
Correct.
Can you have a CEO accountable to a board in the same way? Can we really have executives in the country that would be accountable to the broader population? And can you make those choices? So it's kind of intriguing to think about analogically where the responsibility lies across the community, and everybody needs to participate with the willingness that will go across. So that would
Okay.
point of view.
Final question for my panelists. Please be very brief, as we only have about 5 minutes left. So amidst the gloom and doom of reports about climate change, burgeoning youth population, and things of the sort, what can we be hopeful about as far as Africa is concerned? What's the light at the end of the tunnel?
The light at the end of the tunnel, since we're here, is entrepreneurship. But we need to have a real look at it. We have to distinguish real entrepreneurship from the fake, glossy narratives of tokenism that we see. The fake narrative of $48 producing a robust small or medium-sized enterprise with turnovers in thousands of dollars is just a white lie. For entrepreneurship to succeed, we need to move beyond this and put in the regulatory frameworks, the deferred tax regimes, the soft loans, the training and support systems, access to markets that entrepreneurs everywhere need. This is how the Asian tigers became tigers. That's what Alice Amsden's research showed us. We didn't just become tigers by being beaten down the way we do to them on the African continent. Trump did not become a successful businessman because he's smart. He inherited a lot of money. I mean, anyone with that amount of resources can be a successful business person. You know, so we shouldn't. Africans are some of the most entrepreneurial people in the world. If we're not moving forward entrepreneurially, it means that we haven't put in the systems and the resources to move ahead. Botswana just signed a deal with DBS again. We say Botswana is great because they put in institutional mechanism. That is necessary, but it's not sufficient. That deal they just signed, they're taking 50% of the diamonds, and DBS is taking 50% of the diamonds. Right now, my country, Ghana, is negotiating an oil deal. We're taking 10% of the oil. And then we say that we may take another 5%. But the conditions for taking this 5% are made so that you fail in taking the 5%. So you are stuck with 10%. How can you ever develop with a regulatory framework that pushes 90% of the resources outside of the country?
Thank you very much, Mark.
Sure, so I think what we have to be optimistic about, or certainly what I'm optimistic about, is just continued slow march towards an integrated sort of African ecosystem. I think integration is key, regional integration is key for development. If we look at the other examples, even though the EU is sort of backtracking now, it does have a period of about 30, 40 years that led to a lot of prosperity. So things like the African Free Trade Area, so on, plans for single currencies going forward, I think will lead to the ability of lots of African countries to get huge scale that will lead to development.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so briefly, I think things to be hopeful for. Number one, actually, there is a huge awareness to create a different image or equity, brand equity of the continent. I think that's great. Whether it's free trade or all these things that we talk about, will be a differentiator to create value for the continent. So that's kind of one. Second is population growth. In fact, you could argue it's a negative thing, but it's really positive. The future consumers will be in Africa. 1 in 4 people on the globe live in Africa by 2050. And that means that all the investment and future opportunities will be in the continent. That will be second. Thirdly, women are taking more pivotal role in Africa. And I think women are probably more entrepreneurial than men in general. I should compliment you on that. And so I think that role is going to help advance it. And then finally, I think it's the youth. The youth is not afraid of change. And of course, at the very, as they say, opportunity always comes at the end of crisis. Whenever there is crisis, there will be also change. So I think these are probably the things that would probably help.
Wonderful. Zenith, briefly.
So I'll add very briefly to what my colleagues have said. The first, as Dr. Hailu alluded to, is that we will have 500 million people in the workforce. And I'm, as an entrepreneur now, I'm beginning to feel that. I had a call earlier on today, and someone suggested this incredible woman who's unemployed today that is going to be great as one of the operational leaders on our team. And there's so many people like her. And so I'm really excited about that. And the second thing is on labeling. There's so many people in our community who are entrepreneurs already. They're shop owners, they're selling sweets on the streets, or etc. And somehow we don't look at those people as entrepreneurs, these street sellers. And I think if we just change our paradigm and think about those people as building a life for themselves and how we can help them scale to what my colleagues have said, that would create change.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you. Let me finish, please. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for the audience. I hope you've been reinvigorated and you see in the broader picture your role as an African. The narrative would only be rewritten by you and I. And so as you leave this place, these are mental burdens you should carry with you. Thank you very much for coming, and it's been a great